Hello, I'm Peggy Dellinger, Exhibit Director at the Ocean Township Historical Museum, located in the Eden Woolley House on Deal Road in Ocean Township. And this is my granddaughter,
Pippa, and I will be helping my grandmother tell the story of how women fought to get the right to vote.
Wow. Pippa and I are here today to show you the exhibit in the Ocean Township Historical Museum on women's suffrage.
Suffrage? What does suffrage mean?
What word does it remind you of?
Suffer?
It does. It reminds me of suffer too. Suffrage doesn't mean suffer. It means having the right to vote. But it sounds a lot like suffer. And in fact, I remember the word suffrage because so many women suffered as they fought for the right to vote.
Women couldn't vote then?
It's hard for us to imagine, right, that women didn't have the right to vote. But when we started the nation, after the Revolutionary War, and we started to make the rules for the country, only white men could vote. Women couldn't vote, and people of color couldn't vote.
Didn't George Washington know this was wrong?
It's hard for us to imagine now, because we're in the year 2020, what it was like and how attitudes toward women and others have changed. In this time, and for years even after the country was founded, women had no rights at all when they got married. If they had any money or wealth, all that money and wealth went to their husband. Most women had no way of going to school. They weren't allowed to be doctors or lawyers. They couldn't sign contracts. They couldn't go into business. Most people, men and women, thought that women weren't as smart as men, or as strong, or as capable.
Didn't they get mad? And when did this start to change?
Yeah, you know what? This started to change just at the start of our story in this exhibit. One of those angry women was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and in 1848, she got together with a few of her friends who were also angry about how women were being treated, and they held a meeting in Seneca Falls, New York. And that meeting is the start of the movement to organize to fight for the vote for women. So that's a very famous meeting where the suffragist movement started.
Suffragist? I know a suffragist, Susan B. Anthony. Who was he?
Susan B. Anthony became Elizabeth Cady Stanton's best friend, and they worked all of their lives for a constitutional amendment to give women the right to vote.
What's a constitutional amendment?
Well, the Constitution is the name we give to the rules that were set up when we first became a country that showed us how we were going to govern, how things would work. And the amendment is a way that you can change the rules as you learn things and you want to add things. And so, remember we said in the beginning, women did not have the right to vote, that people of color did not have the right to vote. And so we needed amendments to the Constitution or the rules of the land that would allow women to vote. This part of the exhibit tells the story of the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. And this is the list of demands that they wrote up, including the last and final one, the demand that women be given the right to vote. And then this is a picture of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton as they grew older and worked tirelessly for the constitutional amendment for women's suffrage.
What does this box have to do with that exhibit in women's suffrage?
Well, that's called a ballot box. And a ballot is the name of the piece of paper that a voter marks to vote for the candidate or the question that he, in this time, wanted to vote for. And there's a slot in the top. Can you see the slot? Perhaps you could move the small sign so we could see the slot in the top of the box. You see it? And there's a lock. So you would fold up your ballot, put it in that slot, as if you were mailing a letter, and then it would be locked and kept secret, and then they would count the votes and decide who won the election. The reason it's in our exhibit, and what it has to do with women's suffrage, is to remind us that in 1872, Susan B. Anthony voted in the presidential election, which was illegal, and she knew it was illegal, and she was arrested and taken to jail. Why in the world would she want to go to jail?
Probably because she wanted the world to know that she was in jail and she would be in the newspapers, because at that point she was famous, so people would get mad and they would join the woman's side. So that's why she wanted to be in jail.
So it turns out that Susan B. Anthony went to jail, and it did get in the newspaper, but it didn't change enough people's minds to change the law, and the courts decided that it was perfectly fine for women not to be able to vote. Pippa, let's move into the second part of the exhibit, which is called the second wave of the suffrage movement. And it's the second wave because it was a generation of young women who came and started to fight for the vote. The first wave was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and lots of other women and some men who fought for women to get the vote. They wrote letters, they made speeches, they traveled around the country. Susan B. Anthony tried to vote. They tried to convince Congress to pass a constitutional amendment. But comes 1900, the new century, did women have the vote?
No.
So this new generation of women decided they needed to do things that were more visible and more spectacular to get people's attention and to win the hearts and minds of the American people to their side, the suffrage side, the side that would give women the vote. So one of the first things that this new generation of women did was to hold a spectacular parade.
What made it so spectacular?
Women came from all over the country. 5,000 women came to Washington, D.C. to march.
Wow, that's really spectacular.
And they had fancy floats, and they carried banners, and they marched down the middle of the street. And the hecklers meaning people who were calling names and throwing things on the sides of the road, actually injured 100 of the marchers so badly that they had to go into the hospital. So this was a parade or a march that was making the demand for a constitutional amendment so that women could vote.
I just realized a big problem that they had, because since they weren't allowed to vote and they were fighting for the vote, only men could vote for them to be able to vote, and none of them really wanted them to vote, so they had to vote for themselves, and they had to go to jail, and they had to do all these things, and that was the problem that I'm seeing.
Right, so that is such a perceptive question, because only men could vote in most states, and the men were the ones who could change the laws, and the law had to be changed for women to vote. So how could you get women to vote if women couldn't vote to change the laws to get women to vote, right? It's very confusing. But obviously, the law changed eventually, right? And for the law to change eventually, who had to vote for it?
The men.
The men. So in the end, the suffragists convinced enough men that some of those men became suffragists themselves, people willing to fight for the vote. And they convinced enough men that the law actually changed. That was a wonderful question.
Why is there a jail here?
Well, the jail is here because it turns out that it wasn't just Susan B. Anthony and some of the suffragists from the first wave who were willing to go to jail. The second wave included many women who also went to jail. Their leader was somebody from New Jersey named Alice Paul. And she had her volunteers march in front of the White House. Who lives in the White House?
President.
The president. And the president at that time was a man named Woodrow Wilson. And Alice Paul had her volunteers march in front of the White House carrying signs that said, We demand the vote. When are women going to have the vote? This is not a democracy if half the people in the country are not allowed to vote. And they marched every 6 out of 7 days. Rain or shine, snow, sleet, wind, didn't matter. Those women were out there marching until President Wilson got so frustrated. He didn't believe that there should be a national amendment to give women the vote. And he got so frustrated with these women that he said to the police in Washington, D.C., take them off to jail. They're obstructing people's passage through this street. And so the suffragists began to be arrested. Now, they could have paid a small fine. A fine is a penalty that is in money. The judge says, pay $25, you pay $25, that's your fine, you're let out of jail. The women refused to pay the fine, and they chose to stay in jail. Why do you think?
Because if they stayed in jail, then the newspapers would keep writing about them, and they would get more famous until everyone was like, why are these women in jail? And they would
Right.
the women.
They had to convince the people of the United States, just like Susan B. Anthony tried to when she went to jail, right? They had to convince the people of the United States, including all those men who got to vote, that it was a good thing for women to vote. So seeing pictures in the newspaper of women in jail was making people say, really? My sister? My mom? My aunt? My grandmother? In jail? I don't think so, right? So when the newspapers stopped writing stories about the suffragists in jail, what do you think they stopped? What do you think they did? They stopped eating. Well, what happens when you stop eating?
You start dying?
You start dying and you get skinnier and weaker, right? So now the pictures in the paper are of the suffragists looking sick and weak and skinny, and President Wilson starts to get worried. What's he afraid of, do you think?
Of them, if they die, then everyone will get so mad at him, and then
Exactly. Right. We call that a public relations problem. And he said, enough, I give in. So he agreed to support the National Constitutional Amendment.
What did this rose have to do with the whole suffragist movement?
That's a great question. The red rose became a symbol, in other words, a representation of the people who fought against the vote. They were called the anti-suffragists, and they wore red roses. The pro-suffragists, the people who wanted the vote, wore yellow roses. So when President Wilson agreed to support a national amendment, the Congress passed the amendment and sent it out to the states, and each state had to agree to the amendment that women could vote. And that's called ratification. Each state had to ratify. It came down to the very last state vote that was needed, and it was in Tennessee, and it was August 1920.
That was exactly 100 years ago.
Exactly 100 years ago. And the men in the Tennessee legislature, the men in the Tennessee who made the laws for the state, marched into their Capitol building, and they wore a red rose or they wore a yellow rose. They were either against it or they were for it. And so we have a red rose here because the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, a young man called Harry Byrne, was wearing a red rose, and everybody thought he was going to vote against it. But just before they took the vote, he got a letter from his mother. And you know what his mother said? His mother said, Harry, be a good boy and vote for the vote for women. And Harry said, I have to do what my mother says. And he took off his red rose and he voted for ratification. And the national amendment became the law of the land. And all the women in the country were guaranteed the right to vote. And it was signed into law on August 26, 1920, exactly 100 years ago.
Graham, you told me at the beginning that only white men could vote. What about people of color?
That's a really important question. And the answer to that question is a story that we don't tell often enough. In 1870, after we had ended slavery in this country, we changed the Constitution and gave black men the right to vote.
What about black women?
Black women, no. And there were people who didn't want people of color to vote even after we changed the Constitution to give black men the right to vote. So black women had to fight against people who didn't want them to vote because they were black, and they had to fight against people who didn't want them to vote because they were women.
They had double trouble.
They sure had double trouble. So I think maybe I'll tell you a story about one of the black suffragists. Her name was Ida B. Wells, and this part of our exhibit tells her story. And Ida B. Wells was a writer and a publisher, and she fought hard against the bad things that were happening to people of color, and she fought hard for women's suffrage as well. And the story that I want to tell you brings us back to Alice Paul. Do you remember what Alice Paul did in 1913?
She threw a meeting parade and 5,000 people came.
Right, more than 5,000 women marched in a big deal parade in Washington, D.C. And Ida B. Wells wanted to march in that parade, and she wanted to march with her fellow suffragists from her state. They were marching by state. And most of those suffragists were white, and many of them were Ida's friends and champions. But Alice Paul was worried that if black women marched with white women, it would anger the people who didn't want to give black women the vote and make it harder to get the constitutional amendment for suffrage. So she told Ida, guess what she told her? You can march, but you have to march at the back of the parade.
What did Ida B. Wells do?
What did she do? She said, I don't think so. And so she stood on the sidewalk as the 5,000 woman parade marched by, and when her state came in front of her, she stepped off the curb and joined her white suffragists from her state, many of whom were supporting her, and she marched.
And people of color are still fighting today to protect their right to vote and many more things.
Thank you. Pippa, I wanted to bring you over to this part of the exhibit because this table is dedicated to Alice Paul. Do you remember Alice Paul when we talked about her in the second wave?
Yeah.
What did she do?
She was the lead part of the parade, and she was the leader, and she's actually from New Jersey, and she was a big part of the second wave.
She was a big part. She was the one who organized all of those suffragists who went to jail, correct?
Yeah.
So do you remember what I told you when you helped me put the exhibit together? This is called the ratification banner, and it symbolized the fight to get the constitutional amendment, and they needed 36 states to say yes. So what do these stars represent?
Every state.
Every state. So what happened? Every time the state said yes, what did Alice Paul do?
She sewed a star.
She sewed a star on the ratification banner. This isn't the real ratification banner. It is a facsimile or an imitation of the real one. So what do you think? What do you think about the fight for the vote? Come on over here with me.
It was very interesting. And I can't believe they did all of this. And I'm so glad they did this. Because if they hadn't have done it, we wouldn't be living our normal daily routines that we are doing now.
Right. We wouldn't have our women governors and our women doctors and our women lawyers.
This wouldn't be here.
And this
we never got the vote.
We never got the vote. Right, right. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
The whole thing isn't really over. We're still fighting for people to get the right of things that people don't have, and we're trying to get everything in.
Right, exactly. There are even people today who are being told that they can't vote.
Yeah.
And they should be able to vote. So we may have won the vote, but we haven't stopped the fight. Is that right? Is that our message to everybody?
Yes.
Yes. Pippa, having gone through the exhibit and learned how hard people fought to give women the right to vote. Is there anything you'd like to say to the adults out there who might be watching?
Well, I can't vote, but you can.